really nice to be here with you.
You too.
It's, tell me what it's
Yonasda.
Yonasda. Okay, so I'm so happy to be here with you. Seeing your work online, the work that you do, and our theme is activism. And so, in light of what has been going on all day here, I think today, talking about how we take this knowledge and what we do with it to transform the world is such an important part of our conversation. I have a few sort of theoretical comments or interventions I want to make. Maybe I'll go second, or if you go first, and then maybe we can open it up for some dialogue with the audience, just to talk about what kind of activism, what our understandings of activism are. That's what I'm thinking. So.
Whatever you like.
All right, and I'll also just say, for the few who don't know, a lot of my students are in the room, but I'm Professor Jesse Benjamin. I work here at Yonasda State, and it's just such a wonderful thing to have this event, this space opened up. I really give thanks for that, particularly to Stephen, who's a colleague, comrade, and now a PhD student working with me. It's been really great to have Stephen in our community, and this is an incredible reflection of his leadership, of what he's bringing to our campus. And this has been, in my 12 or 13 years on this campus, particularly the native side of things, has been woefully absent on this campus. And a lot of us have talked about that and looked for openings to address that. So I'm so excited to have this space here right now. And also the idea that the vision is just not a one-off, but this is the beginning of an annual space that is opened up. So I give thanks for that. I'll start with that. I'm going to pass it over to you.
My name is Yonasda Lonewolf. I am a proud Oglala Lakota Native American and Black woman. And my Lakota name is Machakpi Onawami, which means Star Song Woman. My late mother, Yonasda Lonewolf, was a proud enrolled member of the Oglala Lakota Nation in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. She was full-blood Native American. And my dad, Thaddeus McCall, is Black from Brooklyn, New York. And yeah, exactly. And I was born during the longest walk, which was a protest from Alcatraz, San Francisco to Washington, D.C. And so I was literally born with my fist up. And anytime, I would say like the first time that I ever experienced, I'd say my first protest that I could say is when I was in about second grade. It was Columbus Day. And we had to color Christopher Columbus, so we could put him on the wall. And I colored my Christopher Columbus with horns and a red face and a long beard. And that's how I wanted my Christopher Columbus to look. And I got in trouble. And they said, why did you draw your Christopher Columbus to look like the devil? And I said, well, he didn't discover America. He enslaved and he raped, and he just brought so much diseases and everything here to America, and that's how my mother taught me. And so my mother came to the principal's office and was just, do not teach my child incorrect history. And when I saw that my mother stood up with my truth as well as where I got the truth from there on, I was like, you know what, from this point on, I'm standing and speaking up for truth, and those that don't have a platform to do that. So I've been doing that since then.
That's a really amazing story, and I think a lot of us are tangled with, maybe less personally, but with the legacy of Columbus. And it's just one of the things I wanted to meditate on is how inverted and backwards things are. So we encounter a world, a dominant world, or a dominant culture in which Columbus is a hero. Space shuttles are named after him, schools are named after him, and he was one of the most notorious genociders of all time. But it's hard even to say that, because to associate such a negative word with him after he's been lionized, not for 500 years either, since he did that, he was sort of forgotten about, got resurrected, I think, after some St. Louis World's Fair in 1892 or something like that on his anniversary. But for more than 100 years now, he's been so celebrated. So it's just so bizarre and inverted that somebody so evil with so much racism and violence is already celebrated, and then if you speak the truth about that person, or we protest out on the streets, then we're accused of hating America, or we're doing something black or bad. It's quite a thing to encounter a world that's that upside down. We have so much work to do to rectify it.
The thing is that being Black and Native American, I always said that I feel like I'm the oppressed under the oppressed. I was learning about the transatlantic slave trade is the same time I was learning about the Trail of Tears. The same time that I was learning about, you know, so many different injustices of the civil rights movement and dogs, you know, attacking black people, was the same time that I also was seeing that within Indian communities on reservations as well. And the list goes on and on. So I always felt like there was a double pain of generational trauma for me growing up. And one thing I must acknowledge my mother, she did such a great job to make sure that in our way, a Native American way, well, at least in my tribal way, you are what your mother is. My mother was like, no, I fell in love with a beautiful black man, and everything that I loved of this man, I'm gonna learn everything of his history and everything. I'm gonna teach my children to be proud of who they are. So at the same time that I was learning about my tribe in South Dakota, the Ochekee Shakome, the Lakota people, I was also learning about the Southwestern tribes growing up in Arizona, as well as all of the tribes all across the nation. And then my mother said, we're going to keep on expanding there. You're going to learn about the indigenous people of Latin South America, and then you're going to learn about the indigenous people of Canada. And then we're going to go to Africa. You're going to learn about the African tribes. And you're going to also learn about where your ancestors come from. You know, she was like, you're going to learn about all of this. And then, so I was fancy dancing, which is a shawl. One of the sisters was a fancy dancer that was here earlier, and powwows. But I also was African dancing, you know. So my mother wanted to make sure that wherever that drum was, that, you know, I was connected to that drum of the world, you know, of that heartbeat, you know. So she did a phenomenal job to make sure that I was proud to be both. And I've been on platforms, and I was just telling my brother Stephen here, I was just telling him that when I was on the Breakfast Club, and when I first went on my first interview in the Breakfast Club, on such a major platform with Charlamagne and DJ Envy and Angela Yee, the way that I look wasn't Native American enough for so many people because of my beautiful melanated skin. But that didn't make me less than who I am. I never tell anyone to deny your mother or your father. So who are you to tell me to deny who I am and who my parents are, and the languages and the culture and the pain, and even being a descendant of Africans and a descendant that also went through slavery. I'm not ashamed that my ancestors were slaves, because that just goes to show that they were fighters, they were warriors, you know? And then I'm a product of all of that pain. I'm a product of all of that joy. I'm a product of all of that love that's embedded within our DNA. So, you know, sometimes we get so caught up of what mixed people should look like, you know, and or what Native Americans should look like, or what a black person should look like, and not really understanding that you don't know that when you begin to have knowledge of true self and being proud of who you are, you know, then that's really the thing that we have to move past. And I'm so grateful that there is a platform that you develop by having this conference, to have these uncomfortable conversations, because it needs to happen. Because in 2019, how many of you all have Native American in your lineage? Raise your hand. And you don't look like the typical what people want you to look like. You're proud of who you are. You know that who you are. You know, and my medicine man once told me, he said, there's a difference between race and culture. You know, culture is a way of life, you know. So when you're able to understand your culture, you know, that was something that my mother wanted to make sure of.
So much important things you just said here. There's so many things I want to riff off of that. So many things. So, I mean, you started by identifying, on the one hand, what's a double challenge or a double burden, which then also turns out to be a double blessing, because it's two really powerful historic cultures of resistance and survival, and just important ancestral knowledge and wisdom. So it's both things at the same time. one of the things I've been fascinated in my studies, different parts of the world, in Africa, the Middle East, here in the United States, are amongst oppressed communities that I end up finding myself in, because I always end up drifting towards oppression, finding the oppressed communities, and then trying to find out what's going on there and joining that resistance. And no matter where I go, no matter how bad the situation is, a squatter community, there's still hierarchies within those communities. And the Academy likes to, at one point, following a very great scholar, Gramsci, like this idea of subaltern. These are people who are written out of history and are almost not even seen or visible. And so there's this idea of subaltern studies and bringing these erased voices back. One of the things I keep finding is there are subalterns within a subaltern. So if you are in Native communities in general, indigenous, First Nation peoples, we have so little knowledge in our U.S. society or Canadian society about those communities, or actually throughout the Americas. And that's not by accident, it's by design. It's been erased, it's been engineered as part of genocide. And communities are keeping that together, but and trying to bring it back. But to see within those communities hierarchies where you have people who are marginalized, to see the anti-blackness within Native communities, and to sometimes see anti-Native stuff within Black communities. And it happens across all these oppressed boundaries. We've done a lot of work on this campus, I have, and others, around Afro-Latino relationships. And people think it's how are African-descended people relating to Latinos, and then realizing a lot of the Afro-Latinos are Afro and Latino simultaneously. So another thing I wanted to reflect on what you just said is back to the idea of things being upside down, is people who are identified as mixed have to explain themselves, and people who are identified as pures don't have to explain themselves, and yet there are no pures. That's the imaginary weird identity that, when you really think about it, is basically reached its most ugly form amongst the Nazis with their white purity, and they'd make stuff up. They'd be like, well, this, the lead guy, Hitler, has, doesn't have blue eyes and blonde hair, but that's okay, he's in charge, so give him a pass. But they invent their notions of purity. So it's crazy to me, and yet it makes total sense what you just shared. You're on that show, and they're like, you don't look Native enough. So they have this notion of what Natives look like. So we end up having these ideas of what each person is supposed to look like, and yet we've never been singular. Like before white supremacy, before the genocide of the Americas, Native folks were not so light-skinned because of the onslaught of white folks. And so historically, I would imagine that you look very prototypically indigenous or Native American. It's only after this whitewashing that somebody would come back and say that. So it's just these really powerful inversions. I'm really interested in how do we really decolonize this stuff?
The decolonization process is getting back to your indigenous roots. And that indigenous means original, something that's original to the habitat of the land. So when you get back to the indigenous roots, that's also Mother Earth. When you decolonize and get into that feminine, that water, when we was in Standing Rock, we all was in this decolonization process. And we was building a new America at Standing Rock. And it was beautiful because it was people from that. Our medicine wheel is the 4 directions of our people, which is black, white, yellow, and red on that medicine wheel. I have some of the colors represented in this medallion that I'm wearing. But these are the colors that we base the people, the lands, the water, the elements of the, the world. So this medicine wheel, these colors. And so when we were in Standing Rock, we was building a new America of people from all over the world. It wasn't just Native Americans that came from all over. It was everyone that came from all over the world. And what connected us, that calling, so many people that said the reason why they came to Standing Rock was because of that water. That water was calling them. The land of the peoples were calling them. The ancestors were calling them. And so when we was there, we was more so like, we was trading. Do you need something to eat? I have this. What do you need? I mean, we actually went back to that decolonization process of depending more on each other. When we was getting rubber bullet, water cannon, tear gas, it wasn't like, oh, I'm not going to help this white person right here. No, we was pouring milk on each other, on our eyes. We was right there saying, what is it that you need? We did not look at it as a race relation amongst us fighting against those that were fighting against us. When it was prayer that connected us. And we actually fought with prayer. We didn't have any weapons or anything. We had that drum. We had those songs, and everyone, there was actually a huge clergy that came that was different, denominations that came with their certain prayers. Everyone had different types of prayers, but we was all coming in prayer. And that's what connected us. So that decolonization process is really understanding, if you watch National Geographic or any of that, you understand the way that ants are. As small as an ant, the way how they're in order and how they connect with one another. The same way with plants. You could learn so much on how we should be able to work together and relate with one another the way that those creepy crawlers, those insects are. Those winged ones, everything is all of that, in regards to that decolonization process. And if we begin to relate to one another like that, then I think that we'll be living in a better world.
That's really powerful. How many in the audience were at Standing Rock? Was anyone else there? Because that was such a big moment. I know we all watched it closely. We participated in whatever way we could on social media. I was riveted by that. Some of my friends were there. But the fact that we were there and witnessing and participating is important for us. What you're describing is like, it wasn't planned that way per se, but basically around that struggle, the constitution of a liberated zone, of a maroon space, where the rules of the dominant culture can be shaken off and defied, and a more human way of existing can be put into practice. And we all saw that. It was beautiful to see people from all over the world living in a lot of ways the way we all need to aspire to. So that's one of the beautiful things I've experienced in protests too. I remember when we were taking over buildings in New York State, there were a series of issues ranging from police brutality to the curriculum, etc. One of the things people would yell at us besides, go back where you came from, which they like to say that a lot. We had a whole critique of that, including me being here before you and all that stuff, whatever. But they would also say, why y'all dancing and having fun? Like, they thought a protest was supposed to be all straight-faced and serious, and we had that. We were very intense. But then there was drumming all night. We would chill and party, and we were like, we're going to have fun during this protest. We're going to be human beings while we're here. And we were thinking about constituting a world that we wanted to inhabit while we were protesting, almost role modeling, rather than saying, the other thing, which we learned in the mistakes sometimes in the 60s, was we're going to do this struggle now, and after the revolution, when we win someday, then we'll figure out how to have more liberated gender dynamics, or we'll solve some other problems. Really, let's do it all right now. Let's live our truth. And that was a beautiful thing for me to participate in. And I thought it was cool.
You see, like the Maori people, when they do the haka, that's a very scary, dancing song ritual of war. And then when you look at in South Africa, that protesting of them jumping, you're like, oh my God, especially when you see like 500 to 1,000 people jumping and they're doing their chants in their African dialect and song and the drum. That's it. That's who we are. Everything. When my Seminole brothers, one of my brothers, my spiritual brothers, he told me that the cadence that the army does, live, they got that from the Seminole songs. If you hear the traditional Seminole song, it's that fast cadence. And when you're hearing it, you're like, man, that sounds like the army. It's because they took it from them. When that Seminole War, when they was fighting, those were the songs and the chants that they were singing for war. And it was them to keep them in line. So even in the U.S. Army, they're doing exactly what indigenous people have done of that cadence, of routine, of that beat, to make sure you're on beat and you're moving in order. When you're looking at the Koreans, they're right there. Everything is a rhythm. Everything starts with war too.
Right, and so you're pointing out these cultural appropriations, and the key thing there is they're unacknowledged appropriations.
Right.
There's so many. We know the famous cases of, our bicameral government being appropriated from the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, all those kinds of things. We didn't even really bring up the resistance on the level of language as well. So like naming, like you were talking about Lakota, Nakota. There's obviously misnamings. Like almost every single Native community has a misnamed, white name, and it has to fight to actually maintain its own name. And it's very interesting because in all Black communities you have the same thing: is violent misnaming, very disrespectful, dehumanizing words. and then particular moments in history when people are strong enough, renaming and reclaiming their names. And so, two, I like to tell people, you know, there's this military component, and there's this like traditional notion of what struggle is and activism is, and it looks like marching, it looks like military, it looks like coordinated action, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X style. All that is true. But there's struggle at all levels of culture. Like maintaining your language is also part of the struggle. Maintaining your identity or your spirituality is a part of the struggle. So the struggle encompasses everything. I think the haters at my university were, you know, uncomfortable because we weren't protesting in the way they expected us to. And that actually told us we were doing something right. You know?
Yeah.
We should never be doing what they expect us to because it's very narrow-minded. But yeah, I think this decolonizing thing is very tricky because when you study history, all the highest level efforts to decolonize made incredible ground and we study them, and yet they failed on certain levels. And we have to learn from their mistakes as well as their successes. So, you know, I come out of, I wanted to bring this up here and see what the room thought about it too. You know, one of the first sort of conscious, radical languages I learned was political economy, was Marxism. It was one of the second or third time, for very unjust reasons, that I got kicked out of high school. I wrote a paper on Marx because I got beat. I was like, this looks really cool. This is interesting. Nobody told me I wasn't supposed to like him, so I was like, check this out. And it was too good a paper, and I got kicked out, which was very embarrassing in my school. And ever since then, I was like, basically, whatever they say about this guy, he critiqued the capitalist world we live in, and if you read it honest and open-minded, it's basically accurate. And so I adopted that, and not in a cult-like way. You know, some people are a little culty about their Marxism, and it's a bit of a club. But just from a truth point of view, of like this, you know, accurately critiques things. And so one of the big things is, you know, land, and the stealing of land, and then the domination of culture, and how labor is produced, who gets the fruits of labor, private property, all these basic fundamental things need to be understood for a decolonization struggle. And I'm going on too long, but I want to say is, I got steeped in that, but then I realized there's more. And so it wasn't to reject any of that, but to build on top of that. I spent so that was 30 years ago. The last 20 years, I've gotten adding into that, I got very into epistemology, thought structures, and the way we think. And it really filled, my students know I talk about this a lot, it filled a gap that went beyond sort of the Eurocentrism that was unintended but a big part of Marx. And also just a lack of ability to talk about what culture is, because Marx sort of didn't respect culture fully, given a lot of various things. So the thought structure struggle seems really big to me, and it comes back to why things are so inverted. You know, this idea that we have singular identities, or we need to look a certain way to have an identity, or that our identities are rooted in biology. None of these ideas come from indigenous cultures, whether African or you know, from the Americas. None of those are local traditions. Those are all the ideas of white supremacy and of Western European culture that not only got exported, but then got internalized. And so decolonizing those things that are already inside of us, we didn't ask them to be there, but they penetrated into our cultures, is tricky work. And brings us to this really, I think, volatile fault line that you live on, you occupy the identity of that fault line. And many people do. I don't think it's as rare as they want us to believe. It's always like, how do you do that? It's like, there's not the only one. But there are so many identities, you know, where it's like you have 2 or 3 identities, and you're like, wow, it's unusual. First of all, I think those are the normal human identity, and we need to decenter that. But it's a tricky conversation because in a world in which white folks are always on top for the last 500 years, many oppressed communities have adopted some version of pro-whiteness so that they individually can try to get ahead or survive. And so to talk about that is tricky. To talk about Europhilia or pro-whiteness or bourgeois normativity, we can get all kinds of fancy language on it, within Native communities is a touchy subject because there's so much work to do just to bring the reality of Native communities back. And there's these issues of anti-blackness in Native communities. It also, of course, is present in black communities too. Issues with whiteness and with love of white culture or hatred of black culture, that again are not from black culture, but are reactions to this other bigger thing.
One thing I can't stand is classism, and how because that's also an issue that goes to being colonized and decolonizing. It really goes down to wanting to have and a desire of knowledge of true self and knowing who you are. One thing to reference to what you were saying about this line, this dividing lines, that even what this conference is about. I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, and we was the last state to get a Martin Luther King holiday. Yeah, and it was we was also 1%. It was also 1% black people. It was a huge population of Native Americans, a huge population of Mexicans, and I think probably like about 2% Asians, and then Caribbean, and things like that. So we had to unite in order for us to get the Dr. Martin Luther King holiday, and it was all of us protesting against the government on the streets while KKK and skinheads was throwing bottles at us and calling us all types of names and everything while we was fighting for our Dr. King holiday. I'm 40 years old, so this was in the 90s when this was happening. So I know about the KKK and skinheads. I started a riot at my high school, and yeah, I told you I was born with my fist up, y'all. Like, it actually made the NBC. The NBC. Yes, okay. The NBC Today Show. My riot. So on my back with that. This is in the 90s. I did this. So, but the thing is that we had to unite to get our Dr. King holiday. So when I did the 20th anniversary of the Million Man March, or I helped with other major marches, it was easy. It was a no-brainer for me to be able to unite people from all walks of life. I never understood how everyone cannot see the similarity of one another, because I always saw the similarity. Because I grew, like living in Southside Phoenix, it was poor whites, Mexicans, Native Americans, black folks. And maybe some immigrants that came in from Vietnam or Cambodia, but we all understood each other. We all was living in that, living in this certain space. And we all also understood Martin Luther King's dream. And we lived it, we fought for it. And even to the point, my mother was on the committee to make sure that the NFL players boycotted the Super Bowl so we can get a holiday. When, what's the gentleman that just passed away, McCain, he did not want a Dr. Martin Luther King holiday at all. So it was my mother and others of her friends that, that fought, it's okay, I had to kind of on and on, that fought against McCain and all of those government officials to be able to have it. And it was not until the Super Bowl, it was economics. So it goes right back to power and greed. A lot of times it's not usually, especially now, it's not always a race thing. It's power and greed and capitalism. And that's what we're fighting today. When we was in Standing Rock, that oil pipeline is power and greed. Right now, Line 3, there's an oil pipeline that is going through through Minnesota. That is, the Ojibwe people are fighting against that. That is, once again, another oil pipeline. The wall, that's happening right now, that Trump is really trying to build right now, that's power and greed. Right now, the Brazilian people are fighting for their lands right now because of power and greed. So we're up against a whole nother major, I think it's always been power and greed. It's just been those that are want to be able to be in those positions, But sometimes it's our own people. I was helping Shakisha Clemens. Shakisha Clemens was a young, she's what she is, she's still alive, thank God, but she's a young black sister that was sexually assaulted by police officers at the Waffle House. And myself and others of the NAACP and other organizations, we started a launch to boycott the Waffle House. And after her video went viral, there was other videos of discrimination against black people at the Waffle House. So we said, boycott the Waffle House. Bernice King, Dr. Martin King's daughter, she said, boycott the Waffle House. A lot of people were saying, boycott the Waffle House. Now when you go to the Waffle House, Super Bowl weekend was just last weekend, everyone's at the Waffle House. Sometimes it's your own people that you're fighting against. Even at times when we say, you know, I stood with Kaepernick. I stood with Kaepernick when he took a knee because I don't have a lot of followers. I don't have the platform of Kaepernick. But when my cousin was shot by police, by tribal police 16 times in South Dakota, when my friend Romaine Brisbane was shot by police in front of his children in Phoenix, Arizona, bringing home food to his children, and the cop shot him in the back, and while he had food in his hand. My best friend's son, he was 13 years old. The police here in Georgia shot him in the back of his head. So when Kaepernick took a knee, I felt that. When Kaepernick took a knee, I needed that. And I know Mike Brown's family, Trayvon Martin's family, Sandra Bland's family, and the list goes on and on. When he took a knee, I know that they needed that awareness and that platform from someone on that type of caliber. So I stood and I stand with Kaepernick. And there were so many people during that time saying, here at Kennesaw State, I met with the cheerleaders that took a knee. They protested with us in front of CNN. I met them. And so we stood with them. There were so many people that said, I'm taking a knee. It wasn't about Kaepernick, but it was about him using his silent protest to say, I stand with the families that have not got justice against police brutality. So when he took a knee, and to see so many of my own people going to Super Bowl, going to NFL-sponsored events, that's one said, I stand with Kaepernick, but man, they was turning up over the weekend. So sometimes it's our own people that we're fighting against, because it's not always race. It's about power and greed.
It's true, and it infiltrates our culture. So, you know, in order to have fun, in order to watch a sports event and so on, people are just like, I'm going to put my politics on the side. Not everybody's willing to live their politics fully all the time, and it definitely feels, as an activist, like that metaphor of paddling against the stream. You know, it's like eventually you get tired, your shoulder gets tired, you're paddling, and that stream just keeps going this other direction. It is very hard to have such a powerful dominant culture just coming at you one after the next. On the flip side of that, one of the things that I just, you know, on the counter side is kind of bugged out. So Kaepernick took a knee, a couple folks took a knee. It's like it's a small symbolic act. And the most powerful sports entity in the world, worth billions and billions of dollars, is shook. Like, they're terrified. The fact that they won't let him play because he's going to take a knee, like, all they do is let him play. In a lot of ways, by not letting him play, they're giving him more attention. But the way they stopped Angela Davis from getting an award, because she also talked about another indigenous society, Palestine, and they're like, okay, we need to silence her, gave her extra attention, right? That just happened in Birmingham. So the flip side for me is the power of protest. You know, like, their power in some ways seems to be all-encompassing. It affects our own communities, our own families and friends sometimes. On the other hand, a little bit of protest, and the entire facade starts to crack. You know, so the fragility of the power also, I think, is revealed in those moments, which, you know, is somewhat inspiring, even though we take L's sometimes. You know,
If you don't stand for something, you're going to fall for anything.
No doubt, no doubt, and also that historical memory. You know, fighting over how we remember Columbus, but then how we remember McCain. Like, I never forgave McCain for that. You know, in the 90s, I was riled up. We were fighting on our campus about it. We were in New York, and we were like upset that there was a state that wasn't down with Martin Luther King. Even a watered-down version of Martin Luther King that they feed us, they weren't ready for that. You know, so I couldn't forget that. Everybody starts to celebrate him. I'm like, cool, whatever, but what about this piece? You know, so sometimes just holding those memories gets you in trouble in this particular place as we work to rewrite history and all that kind of stuff. I mean, as I was making some notes just to sit and talk with you all, I was just thinking of how deep it is that we have this concept of native or indigenous or First Nations, which is a powerful concept and one I fully endorse. And the representation of First Nation peoples is really important.
But I was thinking, you can't even have that concept until something else happened first, historically, which is white settler colonizers show up. Until white settlers show up and start to displace Native people, and then Native people are like, wait, this is my land, I don't want to leave, and they try to stay, then it becomes, okay, you've got these Native people, these First Nation people. And what's crazy is, to this day, 500 years later, the Native folks, Indigenous folks, First Nation, are still having to explain and defend and claim themselves. Whereas when I say white settler colonizers, people I mean, in this circle, most of y'all know what I'm talking about, but it's not in our school books. The United States doesn't think of itself as a white settler colony, built on the genocide and removal of indigenous people and bringing in enslaved Africans. And so that's like the ultimate of backwards. You know what I mean? Is the people who perpetrated the violence to create what we have are so powerful that we take them for granted, and then we're debating, you know, on their terms half the time. Who's Native? You know, who has an enrollment card? What's your biology? And these are all the terms that they brought in, the genetic terms. You know, so before colonization, before all that stuff came in, people, and this is, I teach this, but it's hard for people to understand, so I repeat it a lot. You know, our concept of race, the white-black thing that puts everybody on a grid, is only 500 years old max, and it's not ancient, but it seems ancient now because it's been so powerful for a few centuries. And I collect these stories just to prove it in my classes and my writing of examples of non-Western people not thinking like that. You know, so in our culture, in Western culture, I say ours, I'm of it but against it, so I'm slipping with the hour there by accident here. But in our dominant culture here, the notion of difference is threatening. And so the general impulse is to suppress it. You know, Audre Lorde talks very powerfully about it. And so we correctly, and I love when you say that, you know, there's so much in common amongst people who are supposed to be separate and divided. But we've learned also to be, afraid of difference. And I have just these amazing stories throughout history of non-Western people encountering difference in a celebratory mode, in a positive mode, seeing it as a gift or something spiritual, as a blessing, and not. I don't think people were shook or scared of difference, shook by it, you know, back in the day. Now we take that as human nature. It's human nature to stick with your own kind. I don't believe it. And every time we saw Native folks fight back the white settlers and create a liberated space, Black people and even runaway white folks who were escaping indentured servitude were always welcome, in all the examples I've seen. And when Black people resisted and created liberated spaces, Native folks and even non-racist white folks were welcome in that mix. One of my all-time favorite examples, some of you may know this one, from Gwendolyn Miller Hall. She has this beautiful book, Africans in Colonial Louisiana. It's a pretty academic book, but it's worth reading. It's incredible. It should be made into a movie. All these things need movies, they don't get them. But she describes how in the 1730s, the enslaved Africans in Louisiana and New Orleans and surrounding areas rebelled and successfully took over everything and controlled the Mississippi, had their own nation, had their own flag, had their own government, set up their own non-racial world. And the majority of those Africans weren't just random Africans, they were specifically Bambara. And they brought Bambara cultural codes in, and non-Bambara Africans were also there and welcome. But they created a non-racial state here in the U.S. that most people don't know about. There were little threads of it, and I think her book really restored that peace to us. For about 20 or 30 years on the Mississippi, there was an African kingdom that wasn't just African, but it exemplified non-Western culture to the point where race wasn't really a factor, but not in that cheesy, colorblind way that people like today. I don't see race. They saw race. They were like, we're not playing by those rules. So to me, I still think it's the ultimate challenge is how do we create non-Western ways of thinking? How do we find and celebrate them, elevate them, learn from non-Western thought? Because
it's the before Columbus complex, to get back to that, right back to your indigenous roots. It's we was already trading with one another before Columbus. We already knew each other. You know, my tribe, we're the Plains, so I'm not from a shoreline tribe, but I met and connected with a lot of the tribes that are from the shores. And their stories of trading with one another from Africa to Asia. They were already connecting and going across those waters. And even then, before Columbus, the waters were much closer too. So, but they was already connecting. And you know, when we look at the cowrie shell, who has a cowrie shell? Anyone? Yeah, she has it in on her earring. So those cowrie shells comes from the shores of Africa. But what was so crazy is that our traditional, well, I know that we have shell dresses, and I was asking my aunt, I said, I want, can you make me, my aunt on my mother's side, my Native American side, I said, can you make me a shell dress with the shells on it? And that cowrie shell is the feminine quality. And that we use that for money in Africa. But then here in the Native American tribe, so I asked my aunt, where do we get the shells from? Like when you look at Native American, especially the Plains natives, that's away from the water. So where do we get those shells from? She said, oh, there would be grand events with the tribes that was on the shores of Native America. So like like Washington and that, California, because they would get the shells from overseas. So then they would meet them halfway to get whatever they can trade. So I was like, oh, so my tribe may have not had contact with Africans, but those from the shores had contact with Africa to get those certain things. So we always were trading and intermixing with one another before Columbus. If we get back to that way, one thing that connects us all, forget race, one thing that connects us all is love. It's something within, it's in our DNA that we feel in the pit of our heart of love. So when we love to a certain extent, you're willing to share and to mix and to have conversation and to want to learn from one another. So that's the reason why, it's when that is broken, then that's where everything comes after that, a fight, a war, and everything like that. Something was broken there. So what you're saying in regards to, when we look at the Black and Native experience of Turtle Island, when you look at Black Wall Street, and I said this before on the Breakfast Club, is that Black Wall Street was on Native American sovereign land in Oklahoma. And it was the blacks and the Native Americans that built Black Wall Street. And so many people want to just make it like, oh, well, that was just black folks. No, it was Native Americans and blacks that did that together. Maybe some Latino people too, But they built Black Wall Street. When you look at the Seminoles, I visited the Seminoles and they welcomed me, and I did a tour of all of their reservations recently, this in 2018. And I'm looking, I'm like, man, these people look like me. And I'm hearing and I'm learning, like, this, want to learn from their stories exactly what the sister that's chalked up, that just talked to us and said, yeah, no, we were together. I want to learn and know these stories from oral tradition, and oral, not always in the book. Because our books were songs. Our books was hieroglyphics. Our books was in our blankets. Our stories, our history, everything was, when you look at slavery, to know where the North Star was in the quilts. Everything was in the quilts. And that commonality is even in the Lakota, in my way, we have our stories in our quilts. Or now we have it on our ribbon skirts, where we're telling that story. Or we have it on our buffalo hide, where we're telling, we do it once a year, where we're sharing exactly what happened in that year. Everything is, or it's in our songs, or, or just sitting back. So I travel the land to learn and hear from our elders. What is the creation story? Oh, we came from our star relatives, and we came down through the Milky Way. Learning these different stories, and then you start noticing, like, wow, that story sounds similar to the story that I got from the Baba and from Africa. Or that story sounds similar from the other, from the elder down in Amazon. Or, you know, and the list goes on and on. I met a sister from Switzerland, and she said, I'm from the Samu tribe in Switzerland. I said, what? Like, I mean, you know, that was new to me. I was like, wait, hold on, y'all have tribes in Switzerland, you know? So in meeting her, she was like, I would say our sister's complexion with the earrings on, but she had bright blue eyes and jet black hair, and she said, I'm from the Samu nation in Switzerland. She said, we are the indigenous people of Switzerland. We lived all throughout Switzerland, and then we was pushed out from, you know, from Europeans that came through Switzerland and told us to go up to the mountains. So she lived, you know, so her people are in the mountains, and she said that they have their animal that they use a lot is the reindeer. I mean, she was decked out in all types of, you know, buffalo, I mean, not, but reindeer hides and everything. I was like, wow. You know, I said, I want to go to Switzerland to learn about your creation story. And I said, you know, sing me a song. And it sounded very African. And I was like, wow. So we all been trading and intermixing and way before what we learned in the textbook of who the first explorer was. We was already explorers. We were already traveling the lands and learning from one another. So everything, when you look at our beadwork, you see the connection in our beadwork. Like, wow, that looks like, like when you look at the Seminole regalia, their print and even the necklaces looks like the shore of the tribes of Ghana. That print, you're like, wow, that looks like from Ghana. You know, and so you're seeing all of these, and that's the problem, and that's where we have to go into the decolonization process of, we say Matakiasi, which means all non-relations, we are all related. This is our roller coaster way of, we are all connected. Everything is one big circle. Once we get back to that indigenous knowledge, then we, once again, will live in a better place. And that's what we have to get through. And in order to get to that, we have to connect with the people of the earth. This is a concrete jungle, you know, and we have to be able to sometimes get away. Get away, go, there's so many beautiful woods here. Go into the woods, go and connect. And when you continue to go and, you know, travel, go past certain areas, you're connecting with Native American tribes and other areas, and to learn ceremonies and to learn all of these things. And when you begin to learn from other tribes, you begin to learn yourself. Your true nature of self is to connect back to that earth.
Definitely. No, it's beautiful, beautiful. And I want to open it up in a minute, but there's just so much to reflect on. And in light of this conversation, but also the whole day and what we're all sort of here for, you know, the fact that we end up having to explain things that should be the norm, you know. It seems like until Western Europe came along with its thought structures, its epistemologies, nobody had ever thought that there were non-human humans before. And to me, that's this modern world we live in, where there's humans and lesser humans, or non-human humans. And I know, like, one of my favorite theorists, who's very abstract, so nobody reads her yet, but Sylvia Wynter talks about how this entire Columbus period, the last 500 years of white settlers, is the era of man with a capital M. And it was male-dominated, and it was white, and it was bourgeois, and it was colonizing. And she talks about getting us back to the era of the human. And it's another way of saying what you just said, which is that we're all connected. You know,
yeah, I saw, you know, there's a diagram that says it's, you know, the colonized way of thinking is man, and then you have what's like the biggest animal, and then like elephant or something, and then underneath that, and then it goes down again. No, but the decolonizing way of thinking is man, and then it's elephant, and it just keeps on going around in a circle.
Right.
It's not a pyramid.
It's not hierarchical.
Exactly, it's a circle. So we're all connected to one.
Definitely.
You know, to one life force, to one, you know, to the various different beings of the Creator that the Creator created.
I think all open-minded people resonate with that, because it's just, rings true across all disciplines and all modes of thought, that circularity and that linked connection, but we've been taught separation. So like when Charlemagne and the crew were like, you don't look like you're supposed to, that's a slip. They didn't mean it, but that's this thing that happens to us where we realize that we reflect. That's us being colonized. When you said that, I was like, what about Afro-Amerindian? Haven't they read Sertima? Like, you know, they were Black Indians back in the day. And the idea, this is another thing. I remember like when I grew up in Canada, part of my childhood in Toronto, and I went to a really nice school. I went to a lot of schools. But one of those schools, they had us like making sort of native dioramas, and we would make the longhouses with various, village settings. And so it was very sort of small focused, and it was very innocent. I was in second grade, and I was very captured by it. It was local history. But the implication of that, coupled with the implication of Columbus being a discoverer, was that all these native cultures were somehow simple and isolated from one another. And the reality you just described, and the reality I've learned as a scholar, is that before Columbus arrived, before Europeans came and started to mess things around, everybody was already completely connected. People traded across thousands of miles with each other. I always tell my students this Kennesaw story, because a Kennesaw archaeologist was on a discovery in the Pueblo Indians, but they were digging around and they found 2 sets of ceramic wares in everybody's houses, in the old houses, in the cliff houses, and they realized one of them is for the cocoa that they like to drink, and that was coming from South America, and this was like thousands of years ago. So that tells you there was a well-established trade route. And then the next thing was that there were parrots in every house, also from the Andes. And so I tell my students, like, it's not an accident that you get a delicate parrot off of the tallest mountains in the world up to Arizona area, across thousands of miles alive. That's an established trade route. You can't just accidentally do that. And every house had parrots. So this is just a level of luxury and sophistication, luxury goods, luxury trade. The cowrie story, I could riff on that because we know that that's the currency in West Africa. Not a lot of people know this. In East Africa, there's these mounds of the cowrie shells where they excavated them in Somalia and the Kenya border. They weren't currency over there so much. So people would come on boats and get these shells and come over to West Africa, and they would have all this currency. So even just the West Africa, East Africa trade, people wanted to act like West Africans didn't know anything about East Africans, right? They were just on a continent together, but unaware of each other until white people figured out how to connect.
Like how we don't know no one in Washington.
It's so condescending, exactly. Yeah, precisely, exactly. It's crazy. So it tells you white people are the only ones who could go on long voyages, and now they're discovering that the Pacific Islanders, are sailing from not just Indonesia to Washington State, and from Indonesia area to Hawaii, obviously, and places like that. But as an East African, I also know that thousands of years ago they sailed the other direction to Madagascar, and we still have a lot of cultural impacts there. That's planetary sailing. That's like 7/10 of the planet being circumnavigated, and we're talking 2,000–3,000 more years ago. So all that gets erased. Part of it is, in addition to this political economy domination where you steal land and control government, and all the stuff that is accurate in Marxism, is this other piece about dominating history. Like if that history is taken away, and people don't know that, it's easier to believe these other simplifying myths. And that's one of the things I think that gets us. I do a whole bit in my classes just because it's so powerful, and you can't unsee it once you hear it, of how many of us have been told that the pyramids, all the pyramids, wherever there's a pyramid, an ancient pyramid, was built by aliens, right? And it just seems like an innocent story. You're watching a sci-fi movie, and the pyramid show up. And then you realize how profoundly white supremacist a race it is. You have to, we have to erase this history because this is proof of the sophistication and brilliance and engineering and all these things in the Americas and in Africa.
Wait, aliens didn't build them?
Not aliens, and by the way, it wasn't slaves either. They wanted to say it was slaves so they could justify slavery too. Neither were the case. So even the pyramids are there, you can't deny them. Like, we'll find a way to deny it. And it was a scientist. It was an archaeologist. I read an archaeologist in like 1898 in East Africa was saying the pyramids might be built by aliens, and also we can't figure out Great Zimbabwe because it's just too big. It's too vast. We can't figure it out. Sure, they had a lot of gold trade, but he actually said in 1898, I think these might be, from my main hypothesis, it could be aliens. So they're trying to figure it out.
Yeah, like we were stupid and dumb and savages and we didn't know anything.
Right.
That's how, yes.
So we gotta reclaim that history and decolonize that history. I think that's very key as well. Well, it's fun talking with you, and I feel like a kindred spirit on the activism tip and the decolonizing tip. I could definitely go on, but how are we doing on time, Stephen? Do we have time for some Q&A? Maybe just a little. Okay, so does anybody want to add a comment or throw a question in? Maybe we could do 2 or 3 real quick and then respond to that. Please.
I just recently read some information that the first use of the term white people came about 350 years ago to separate poor whites from the enslaved and even free Africans, so that they could have a demarcation line between the groups, and that also includes Native people, so that once they started using the term white people, because prior to that they were Europeans, once they started using that term and giving it specific designations, like you're better, you come from a superior group, you have certain privileges, and then they took the privileges away from other people, that was, until that point, until about 1650 or so, everybody enjoyed. Even though there were Africans who were enslaved, they were sometimes freed, or they were indentured servants, and after a certain period of time they would gain their freedom and independence. The Native people were joining, as you said, with the people of African descent and working together. And so they had to find a way to divide the people, and that's when that designation of white people came into existence by the few elite, that 1% again that we talk about now. They were the ones who coined the idea of a separate group and used the idea of a superior race and Darwinism and the survival of the fittest, because they had the gun and gunpowder and the use of those tools to captivate and
all that is
captivate.
Very true and very on point. And I do have a comment on that, but we want to maybe take 2 more quick comments, and then we can do a final, sort of wrap this up, because I do think we're running out. It was a very important piece of this puzzle. Anybody else want to, on any direction? Marcus?
I was just thinking about, kind of piggyback on what she said. I'm thinking about, like, basically, like, when you think about how African people and Native people, they're kind of pitted against each other throughout history. Like, you think about the Buffalo Soldiers, how, like, basically had people come and attack Native folks, like, hey, maybe we get your freedom this way, you kill the Native. And then you have, like, white people trying to sell Africans and Natives, like, you got to brutalize them like this. So now you come to this day, right? Trying to get people to come together. You have revolutionaries saying, well, Natives own slaves, so they don't. They don't even really want to hear, like, the whole story, because they've already been ingrained that that's the enemy. It's funny that they're not the enemy at all. When someone taught you they are, put you in the same case, and hey, they talk about your mom and now fight.
Yeah.
Right? How we get together.
So that divide and conquer and miseducation piece is very key. We'll work on that too. Do we have a third real quick? Go ahead, Senator.
Just wanted to get your feedback. You talked a lot about your mother and how she instilled these lessons in you from a young age. I'd just like to get some best practices for doing that for my young woman.
For your what?
For my daughter.
What nationality is your daughter?
Her mother's Bermudian, I'm African American, and I'm just more interested in how to engage her at a young age. She's 4 years old.
My mother, at a young age, she made sure that I was reading books from Native American authors, as well as African and African American and Latino authors, to read their stories. The other thing too is that we would celebrate Cinco de Mayo, we would celebrate Native American Heritage Month, we would celebrate Black History Month, and she was very serious about celebrating, like whatever was happening in the city of these places, these holidays or these moments, she was like, oh, we're going. You're going to learn. Like I was saying, I learned African. I took African dance class, and as well as Native, and I was also a powwow dancer too for fancy dancing. So my mother wanted to make sure, so the Bermuda? Yeah, make sure that your wife is teaching her her culture. And if she's still learning her culture, go through that process together with your daughter. Is it your daughter?
Yes.
Yeah. And then even with you too. You know, my mother was a single mother. So the love that was drawing her, to my father was, she wanted to learn more of who he is, even if he didn't know who he was. But she wanted to make sure that she learned more about who Black people are. And that was something that, so she always made sure my brother and myself was, if you look at like some of my children, like when my pictures of me when I was a child, I was in African regalia, I was in Native regalia, my mother was like, I'm gonna go all the way with this Blackness. Like you're gonna be in like, kente cloth and like everything, like she but you're gonna have a feather in your hair, So she always was like, and even when I went through my phase of, the hip hop culture, she was like, no, you gotta make sure you're gonna wear the African medallion, but you're gonna also have like a Native American choker, She always wanted to make sure that I always was that balance of knowing self. And so my suggestion to you is to do the same. The reason why you fell in love with your wife, learning about her culture, learning about who her family is and her ancestors and all of that, teach that with, to your daughter, and she'll be okay. We're living in a world right now where everyone, like he was saying, everyone is mixed and, in one way, shape, or form, and so it's important for us to be able to learn each other. We live in this world together, we have to learn from each other.
Beautiful. And do you want me to go on other questions?
Yes, I'm open for any questions.
So, well, on the previous two questions, let me just, maybe I'll pick those up real quick, because the point about the invention of whiteness is well taken, and I think you're 100% accurate. My one addition to that is, that's the US version of it, and it's actually about 200 years later, about 150 years later, than in the Caribbean. And so I think, the way I trace it back is I think that whiteness stuff got started actually in the Mediterranean when Christians who were developing a concept of whiteness were kicking out Jews and Muslims and Moors. And Moor was this generalized term for African and for Black. And so by attacking Blackness, and most of the Jews and Muslims were Moors, they were part of a Moorish society, that was the size of the United States, the continental US. It was all over North Africa and also Spain and Portugal. And they were able to just take the tip back and cleanse, they thought, and make the first monoculture, actually. We talk about multiculturalism, and we're like, let's explain that word. I think multiculturalism is a natural human state, if there is such a thing. Monoculturalism needs to get explained, and this is, I think, the first time it really happened. And so they took that with them to the Caribbean, and that was there by 1505, 1510, pretty well established. So early notions of whiteness as the opposite of Blackness and the enslavability of Blackness, but also the Blackness of not being, so in the beginning it was very, you mentioned Darwin, and that really only comes closer to 1800, and it becomes a scientific thing. But for the first 300 years, it was very Catholic and Christian. And the category they were using for incipient Blackness and their whiteness was that all the bad people that they were going after, the Jews, the Muslims, the Moors, the independent women, the witches, the left-handed, it was a very random category of people they were going after. They were all agents of Satan. And so they were agents of God, that whole God on your side thing, everybody else. So what you're referring to is in Virginia and other places when they're creating the slave codes, which really forced people to be stuck in categories. And before that, there was a little more flexibility. And that's the inheritance we have now. And they have different slave codes in Venezuela or in Cuba or in Brazil. They all copied each other as well. So that's the only difference, is I would push it back a little bit further. In the U.S., it got started late, because the U.S. isn't the center. It was actually, at the time, it was an outpost. And Marcus, your thing on Buffalo Soldiers is very key. And I think what's interesting is there were these efforts by the colonizers to pit people against each other. They literally, that was their philosophy and their political strategy, divide and conquer. The British actually call it divide and rule, and they own that. That's their thing. So how do we pit people against each other? How do we find existing tensions and pour gasoline on them, right? And if we can get one group to go after another group, they're too busy fighting each other to see us, right? And it sounds very simple, but it literally is how this was effectuated. And so, on the one hand, I think we need to know those terrible stories and to understand how oftentimes oppressed people got played. But I think the stories of unity and defiance against that are probably far greater in number, but we know them less. Because they wanted us to know those stories of division, you know? I think Bob Marley made that song about Buffalo Soldiers not to tell us that's how it is, but to tell us, study this history, you know? Bob Marley wanted us to decolonize and to know that history. So he, you know, maybe he called more attention to it than anybody had before. But anyway, I think those histories, but also the opposite. It's, when you start thinking about what are the stories of non-colonized behavior that are out there, it's hard to find them. And you know, I feel like I've been collecting them for a few decades. I have a few. But I think our task as humans today is to collect those stories and to make them more available to our children, to our students, to ourselves. And that in some ways humanizes our world. Just knowing the pyramids were built by slaves denaturalizes slavery. Because if you think they were built by slaves, the subtext is there's always been slavery. It's the human condition. And it's just not the case, you know. So many little layers, I think. Another myth is that in the 60s, African and Caribbean nations and Asian nations decolonized themselves, which they did. But I would say that we're on the very, very front wave of decolonization. We're still in a highly colonized world, especially intellectually, in terms of corporations, in terms of power, land ownership. So like, decolonization has just begun. A lot of people are like, oh, didn't we handle that back in the day? But as a teacher, when I bring up race, they're like, didn't Martin Luther King take care of all of that? And I literally get that every semester. And then Obama came along, and his updates, didn't Obama take care of all of that? It's like, no, we're just getting started. You have a lot of work to do, you know? We got started, it was a good start. But, yeah.
And also another thing too is that like what you're saying about the, you know, that divide and conquer, we have to be very social media woke. Social media is right now a tool that is using, a lot of people, they're using that to divide and conquer as well, especially amongst people of color. And so one thing is that, I want you all to write this down or a note or something, but look up Tiger Swan and Standing Rock. Tiger Swan and Standing Rock. Tiger Swan, anyone heard of Blackwater? Yeah. Tiger Swan is Blackwater. So Blackwater was a militia group that were former, you know, military and all of that, and they started a security firm. And they call it Blackwater. And they did a lot of stuff in Afghanistan, everything, you know. But now, now, and as a matter of fact, what's her name, Betty DeVos?
I was going to say Betty DeVos, yeah.
Yeah, her brother is the owner of Tiger Swan. So, Tiger Swan was hired by Dakota Access Pipeline to come and infiltrate Standing Rock. When I went across, so it was Labor Day weekend, I went in front of the bulldozer, and unfortunately, the sister from Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! Was there. And I went in front of the bulldozer to stop the construction. And I'm the most melanated person out there. So I went out there, when you look at it, I'm like, but I went out there and stopped, you know, went in front of the bulldozer to stop the construction, and it was in my spirit to do that. And so they brought out the dogs and the tear gas and all of that, and it went viral. That was the month that Dakota Access Pipeline, which is Energy Transfer, a government agency, Chase, Wells Fargo, SunTrust, Bank of America, every major bank that was invested in the Dakota Access Pipeline hired Tiger Swan to come and infiltrate Standing Rock. In these documents, you could Google it, the Intercept, there was a whistleblower not until a year later, but it was a whistleblower that said that they was sending Intercept.com, which is a very great media source, to look at the documents of what Tiger Swan is doing. And in that first month of September of that year, 2017, of that year was, we have to make sure that black organizations and black people are not coming to Standing Rock. That was one of their major things they had to do. We're also using social media to divide and conquer to make sure that this stays a Native American fight. They use social media. That month, I was I was attacked so bad on social media. There was so many different memes about me, about, she's not a real Native American, going, and she's this and she's that, and we don't need no black people coming to Standing Rock, all on social media from so-called Native American accounts. And I'm looking and I'm like, I'm in Standing Rock, I'm amongst my people. None of these people are saying this to me. Why am I only seeing this online? So imagine at the time, I'm looking at it and I'm just like, oh my God, who's hating me? Like I did not, because I didn't see it physically, but I'm seeing it on the internet. Then so I have, being in a movement, you gotta have friends of all walks of life. So I have someone that was able to track some of these accounts. And they was coming from Russia. This is way before Trump was president. And this was also coming from North Carolina. Tiger Swan headquarters are in North Carolina. They were hired, Russia, and you all can look this up too. Russia is a major component of infiltrating on social media, using social media to wag the dog on conversations, on news. This is where we get the fake news from. And you could look this all up, and what is it? Dateline did a whole story on it and everything like that. So we have to begin to start. They use this technique to make sure. They also said they want to make sure that mainstream media was not coming to Standing Rock, and that it was a Native American, only Native American media sources can highlight what's happening in Standing Rock. So it became more, so the more that we was online promoting, we're in Standing Rock, come to Standing Rock, look what they're doing to us. Remember, many of you all did not see it on mainstream media. Do you know why? Because mainstream media is financed by major sponsors of banks that also finance the Dakota Access Pipeline. So their investors was like, no, you cannot show what they're doing to these people in Standing Rock. Once again, back to power and greed. Then on top of it, more money was going into Tiger Swan that was also going into other militia-type social media cyber terrorist groups to be able to divide and to make these accounts of so-called black accounts, so-called Native American accounts. These were all fake accounts. So you're thinking you're talking to Jamal and he's all like, nah, I went to Standing Rock, they treated me bad. You're like, what? Jamal didn't go, no, that was someone in Russia that you're talking to online. He wasn't in Standing Rock. So this is the type, so we have to, this is what they're doing today, especially in movements and activism. They're using social media to, anytime, okay, have you all ever used or like typed your name? Like let's say that you're saying, hey, how are you? You notice that it says, hey, how are you before you put tab or before you push enter. You're like, how did my phone know that I'm about to say, hey, how are you? You all ever did that? Like, it already tells you what you're going to type. You're like, how does it know my language? This is exactly with social media, with the internet. They know exactly, so anytime there's let's say it's Trump, let's say you type Trump, all of a sudden you start getting all of these people making comments under your Facebook, your Instagram, of like, no, I love Trump. And they're like, man, where do these people come from? It's automatic of how they have it set up for people to basically keep that conversation going in order to have your thought process like, well, maybe I am wrong, or maybe I am right, or, to be able, they're thinking for us. This is how they're moving the cattle, they're wagging the dog of us. So we have to be very beyond woke. We have to be very conscious. And this is right back to getting back to your indigenous roots and learning self from each other, and not always from the internet. And going to the places and being boots on the ground of what exactly is happening, instead of relying on the news and other sources to tell you what is happening to each other and our people. Yeah.
It's a powerful place to end because it gives us a mission. We have to stay extra woke because they're trying to co-opt our wokeness and use our tools against us. So it's, that's sort of where we are right now. I think it's a great place to end. It was great talking with you.
Thank you all for
And,
having me. I appreciate you. Thank you so much.